Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
My blood brother Jim Russell and I used to do a Kent State presentation that took 90 minutes, and so we don't have that kind of time. But so I'm going to change things up a little bit this time. And Russell's the reason why this Scappoose man is in the St Helens Kiwanis Club, because Bill Eagle was friends of both of us. And he pointed out that Jim was a member of this club and the president. And since he was always so kind and sweet to us and thoughtful, when he asked me to join the St Helens Club, I did when I retired. So I'm happy to be here, and it's kind of because of Bill, like maybe a lot of us. But so what I was going to try to do today was summarize the lives of the 4 kids who were killed at Kent State on May 4th, 1970, during a peaceful protest, gunned down, murdered in broad daylight by individuals who were members of the Ohio National Guard. Subsequent to the event, they colluded privately and secretly to say that they fired because they were in fear for their lives. So I'm going to give you some facts and let you decide. But what I'm going to do is just talk. And there is available much more documentation about what happened that day, both online, if you do a search on the internet, and otherwise, especially because, as Russell used to say, you shouldn't try to have a cover-up in front of the School of Journalism. And this shooting happened right in front of Kent State School of Journalism, which is Taylor Hall, which housed the School of Architecture and the School of Journalism. So there were dozens of photographers present, hundreds of photographs taken. So when I tell you my interpretation of things, you can check that by looking at the photos, because they're everywhere. There's some very famous photographers, well, some well-known photographers and then some famous photographers. Howard Ruffner had a whole book of photographs about the Kent State shooting. Let's see if I can remember the other guy's names. William Ling was a photographer. And John Philo was a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer who took the photograph of Mary Vecchio screaming over the body of Jeff Miller lying dead in the street with the blood rolling down the side of the road. He won a Pulitzer Prize for that, and he went on to have a career in photography with Newsweek, NBC, and otherwise. So I want to introduce you to these 4 kids. Jeff Miller, he was 20 years old. He was from Long Island, New York. And I didn't, of course, meet these people because they were dead before we had our 1975 civil trial, but I did meet their families and their parents. And Jeff's mom, Elaine, was from Long Island, a very feisty New York Jewish lady, so proud to have her as a friend. I never did meet Jeff's father because after Jeff was killed, his father blamed his mother for filling him all full of those liberal ideas and blamed her for his death. So I met her as Elaine Holstein. She had remarried a very nice man called Art Holstein, and he was small, quiet, supportive, thoughtful, and always very nice to me. Jeff, if you Google or search his pictures, you'll see his high school graduation picture, which is a little shorter hair than what he had. And he wasn't, these 4 kids, they weren't terrorists. They weren't bums, like Nixon said. They were actually very successful in academics, most of them A students, some of them with scholarships. And Jeff was a reader. He loved music. And he was probably yelling at the guardsmen when they shot him. He was 270 feet away. 270 feet away. And the reason I say he was probably yelling, it had to do with a story conversation that I had with one of our attorneys who was from the ACLU. His name was Clyde Ellis. And at the time of our 75 trial, I was 24. And I was even goofier than I am now. And so I said to Clyde, they couldn't have been very good shots because I was only 70 feet away and they didn't kill me. And he said, well, weren't you giving them the finger? And I said, yes, I was. And he said, well, where did they shoot you? Where did they hit you? And they hit me right here. And so he goes, you know what he was aiming for. And so for the same reason, I think Jeff got shot in the mouth because he was yelling.
You got shot twice.
Yeah, the first time was right there. So Jeff's mom was feisty, and she was the last parent to die just a couple years ago. Elaine, she was just something else, a real powerful. She was a smart lady, well-informed, and the way you know a little bit more about her is she was the secretary of a high school. So if you ever go to a school and you want something done, you don't go to the principal. You go to the secretary because they know everything that's going on and everything that's happening. And that was Elaine's job. Next, I want to talk about the only one of these victims who I had really any contact with. It was Allison Krause. Same name as the musician, but a different person, of course. She was 19. She was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She was 340 feet away from the line of guardsmen who fired. Allison was with her boyfriend, Barry Levine, and Barry lived in the same dormitory that I did, Johnson Hall. And since our names were alphabetically sequential, say that fast 3 times, Levine, Lewis, we shared a mailbox in the dormitory office. And so I saw Barry and Allison a couple of times a week. And she was charming and beautiful, attractive in every way, very, very full of life, until that day when the gunfire started. Barry and Allison hid behind a parked car. And after the 13 seconds of gunfire stopped, 67 rounds, when the gunfire stopped, Allison whispered to Barry, "I think I'm hit." And for a couple of seconds, Barry didn't understand what that meant. And then she had serious internal injuries involving half a dozen of her internal organs. And she died in his arms behind that car in the parking lot. The next 390 feet away, 20-year-old Sandy Scheuer was from Youngstown, Ohio. Her mom, Sarah, was like Sandy, a dark-haired beauty. And her dad, Martin, was a Holocaust survivor. These first 3 families were all Jewish families from different parts of the country, as I said. But Sandy was leaving her dorm with books in her arms when the bullet slammed into her chest and killed her. There's not much more that I can say about her. And the fourth student, and I'll try to answer questions you may have when I'm done if there's time left, but the 4th student killed at Kent State on May 4th, 1970, was also 390 feet away. He was an all-American boy, and I mean the epitome of that description. Bill Schroeder was an Eagle Scout when he was 13. He wrote poetry to his mom from campus and sent it to her. His parents were Florence and Lou Schroeder, salt of the earth. Lou was a short, stocky guy, and I don't quite remember what his job was, but I think he was a blue-collar kind of worker. And looking at him, you'd also think that he might have stood up for himself a couple times because he seemed like he had a broken nose. And we hit it off during the trial when he could take off work and come. We went to lunch a couple times and had a Reuben and a beer in a bar in Cleveland where this 75 civil trial took place. Bill's mom, Florence, was a beautiful white-haired homemaker. Looking back 50 years, it's hard to think about how old they would have been, probably in their 40s. But she was very brave. Florence came to the Kent State commemorations after the event and spoke a couple times about the loss of her son that day. It was very, very moving. Bill was ROTC cadet, and they suggested he was probably lying prone on the ground when the bullet hit him and ended his life. And so those are the 4 victims of Kent State who I wanted to introduce to you today. I have photographs of them. You can search them, Google them, and you'll see images of them. And like I said, they were innocent of any wrongdoing. They didn't commit any crimes. They were actually good kids. Allison was in the honors college. Bill had a full ride scholarship to the Colorado School of Mines, but he transferred to Kent State because he wanted to take psychology courses, and they didn't have any at the Colorado School of Mines. Sandy was a quiet person, and I don't know about her academics, but I know she was probably very successful. She was highly thought of by her friends. Jeff, likewise, he was a reader. And over the years, Lisa's gone with me about 20 times to the commemoration. I try not to miss it. May 4th, I'm in Ohio. And so we've met the siblings of these folks, and what I discussed with Brady on air on Saturday, a couple of Saturdays ago, was when it comes to traumas like this, or death by guns, it's a ripple effect out to the families, not just the immediate family, but each of these people have brothers or sisters that we've gotten to know, and the impact on them is measurable and observable. And so a tragedy ripples out from the people who are immediately involved to the people who know them, and their families, and the people who care about them. And I'm sorry for the short, impactful, upsetting conversation that we're having today, but I would like to try to answer any questions you might have about things that happened that day. I know that it's hard to stop and think about the impact on what might have been to your family, because these kids were no different than your kids. And like I said, they didn't do anything wrong. And like I've said about me and Russell, because we did our presentations together for years in high school and college classrooms in Oregon. And after a while, we got so familiar with each other, we could just exchange thoughts even in our heads just as we presented these things. But I wish you knew him. He was, what I used to say is, we weren't terrorists, we were smartasses. I have a photograph of Russell confronting some National Guardsmen. It was the night before the shootings. And the National Guard was enforcing a curfew. It was 10 o'clock in the city of Kent, 11 o'clock on the campus. And the photograph is Russell. He's got a headband on. He looks kind of like a hippie. And there's 2 guardsmen with fixed bayonets speaking to him, and he's standing on the corner of the grass in front of his fraternity. And they said, you're in violation of the curfew. You better get inside. And being a smartass like we were, he said, I pay property on this area right here. We pay property tax, and this is my fraternity, and I'm not going anywhere. And one of the guardsmen took his billy club, slapped him in the knee so hard that he fell to the ground. And so Russell ever the smartass, struggled back up to his feet, and the guardsman said to him, "I guess you'd be moving along now." And Russell said, "Only if you hit me in the other knee." And I don't think he did, but I have a photograph of that I treasure. Think about my friend Russell. We spent a lot of time together. We did a lot of presentations together. At the end of which I said, because it was so heartfelt and so emotionally laden, when it was over, we'd say to each other, "What did we say?" And we couldn't really summarize what we had just said, but we knew the impact on the people who heard us was significant and real. He had this way of looking at me with this twinkle in his eye at certain points in our time together, mostly when we were having fun. And I believe you can't have too much fun, but we were having fun, and Russell gave me this look. It was like, "Yeah, we've done it now." Kind of like the Laurel and Hardy thing. "This is another fine mess you've gotten us into, Joe." Well, so I treasure his memory, and I miss him terribly. Sorry for the raw emotion, but that's the way it goes. Can I answer any questions somebody might have? Jenny?
Was there ever any consequences for the perpetrator?
Good question. There were never anybody charged with murder or manslaughter. After our civil trial, where it was the only way we could get into court, because, and I think next week, if we have time, I'll try to go through some of the legal things. We had to go through the legal ladder to even get into the courtroom, because the first legal hearing was the state grand jury, which was held in Ravenna County, right down the road from Kent. And the result of that was 25 indictments, all of professors and students. I was shot twice. The second guy who shot me on the ground after I was already writhing around. I was arrested. I was indicted and arrested for a misdemeanor, second-degree riot, participating with 4 or more others in an attempt to block or prevent official action. And I did give them the finger, but they shot me twice, so I don't know. So those records were expunged upon review. Another judge had them burn the document in the courtroom, in the courthouse parking lot, because they dropped all those charges. Then there was several other investigations, including the President's Commission on Campus Unrest, was called the Scranton Commission, which Nixon hoped would whitewash the shootings, and they did not. Their conclusion was like former Governor Scranton of Pennsylvania and some other people who were, politicians well known. Their conclusion was the shooting at Kent State was unjustified, unwarranted, and inexcusable. There was FBI investigations. There was a testimony before the state grand jury, before the federal grand jury. The federal trial involved conspiracy to deprive students of their civil rights. And that was, we were represented by the Justice Department lawyers, which I think means the fix was in. So they presented some of the evidence, but not all of it. And they said they were saving some of the evidence for rebuttal. But before they did, the judge dismissed the case for lack of evidence, so that didn't go anywhere. So what we finally had to do was go to civil court for a lawsuit. And so the parents and the survivors tried to sue the governor of Ohio and the state of Ohio and the individual guardsmen who were most likely culprits in shooting into the crowd. But it turns out you can't sue. In those days, you couldn't sue the government because they were protected by the old rules called the divine right of kings, where the leaders get their power directly from God.
Oh my God.
So they were above reproach. So we went into court in Ohio, appeals court, lost the appeals court, went to the Ohio Supreme Court, we lost at the Ohio Supreme Court. We went to the United States Supreme Court, and it's very impressive. If you've ever been there, we went to it. Dean Kaler and I, who was paralyzed, shot while he was lying on the ground. The bullet severed his spinal cord, and he's been paralyzed since. He and I went together, and some of the other people, and our young 38-year-old lawyer presented our case at the United States Supreme Court and overturned the divine right of kings. So that we then had the ability to sue for the things that were done wrong by the government, the governor, and these individual guardsmen. So that led us to the 1975 civil trial that I was talking about from my experience. And that's where we all kind of really met. This trial was 14 weeks long in the summer heat in Cleveland, which is high humidity. And the worst part of it was across the aisle from us were the guardsmen who shot us and who killed their children. And they were laughing and joking. It seemed like they knew all along they would get away with it. And the jury in Cleveland did not find in our favor. It found in their favor. And if you probably don't remember unless you're pretty old, at the time, most people blamed the students for what happened at the shooting.
My understanding was that Jim Russell had a problem getting his job at the city of St Helens because Geneva Shadley, who was that mayor at the time, found out that he was a survivor of Kent State, and she thought for sure that he'd be a problem.
Jim was a genius, and what we found is, in certain audiences, you didn't mention their history
And then his
and
father
things that
lost
happened.
his job
Yeah,
because of Jim being shot.
yeah. And other participants, John Cleary was an architect, and he didn't mention it to anyone. He didn't participate in the commemorations early on to protect those kind of opportunities you might have. So the impact is far-reaching, and as far as I'm concerned, long-lasting. But what I'll finish up with is something I've said at our meetings before, when I was the president and got to spend all my time listening to myself talk. Some days I don't remember how lucky I am to be alive, but not this day. Thanks a lot. Any other questions?
I
Yes.
always have a question.
Yeah, sure, Judy.
Did any of these National Guard individuals, to your knowledge, ever come forward and try to make apology or accept
No.
responsibility?
No, the guy who shot me first has passed away. And people would ask me, have you ever talked to him? And no, because he always continued to say that he was afraid for his life. And he and I, and anyone else who was there, would know that it wasn't true. I was downhill, 70 feet away, motionless and silent. And he had a .30 caliber rifle with a bayonet on the end, tear gas mask. So, I mean, he said he could see my right hand, which I'll demonstrate as long as there's no photographs taken. He could see my right hand just fine, but he thought I might have a weapon in my other hand.
Oh my God.
So in fear, he shot me.
And shot you a second time.
Well, then another guy
Oh, is it
in our civil trial. This is where that came out, and I know, Bill. It's stunning. They were questioning another guardsman, and they had admitted previously to shooting me, and so they asked him on the witness stand in the civil trial, "Is it true that you shot Lewis after he'd already been shot, writhing on the ground?" And he said, yes, it was. And so our lawyer asked him, so why would you shoot someone who had already been shot? And this fellow, whose name I won't give, said, well, everybody else was shooting him. And so our attorney looked to the jury like, did you hear that? Do you know what that means? And still, we didn't get a settlement or judgment that we would have preferred.
So there was never any consequences.
Well, ultimately, I'm glad you brought me back around. Ultimately, during the civil trial, our judge was so biased, he wouldn't let the jurors see photographs of the wounds or the bodies of those killed because he said it would be prejudicial.
Oh my God.
Well, this is what we're talking about here, So he made that error and a lot of other errors. Like, for instance, the one that galled me the most was Governor Rhodes, who made this fiery speech about these are the worst people we harbor in America today, meaning students who did nothing wrong. He came to testify in the courtroom, and And I was 24, so I was a young smart ass, like I said. He came into the courtroom and he had blue hair, you know, like the ladies used to do, it was blue. I'm like, and the judge called him Your Excellency. And that rankled me so bad because from my point of view, and many of us shared the opinion that he was responsible, at least partly, for what happened that day. So the judge made a bunch of different errors. And so on appeal, the jury's decision was overturned, and we had the opportunity to have another trial, another civil trial. Well, this first trial was 14 weeks long, and it was hell every day to see those rascals who had shot us and killed these children. And at the time, I said myself, the trial was worse than being shot in some ways, just to have to go through those, because every day we'd hear testimony, you know, about how it happened, and, you know, and you relive it in your heart and mind, and it was hard. And so the state of Ohio decided to make a settlement offer of cash for the money they had budgeted for the trial expenses. So it was something like $675,000 that they had budgeted for this trial. And the person who needed it most, of course, was Dean, because he's in a wheelchair. So he got about half of that money. And then the rest of us got, depending on the nature of our injuries, a certain specified amount. I got $40,000. The parents of the 4 people who were killed got $15,000. And that was the best, at the time I said this is the best outcome we could hope for based on the prejudices of what we were seeing around us. And so that was the outcome. No one was ever found guilty of manslaughter. No one was found guilty of murder. And I understood that for a few years they had parties every May 4th to celebrate their victories. So that's really all I have to say, unless you have other questions about it. Thomas.
Yeah,
Joe
so,
Thomas has-
what were they protesting, and what was the build-up for the
Well, this was during the American War in Vietnam, and there had been some protests off campus against the war the previous fall, which I marched in, and Jeff did, and Allison did. But we weren't I wouldn't say activists, we were just participants. And so right before this shooting happened, President Nixon announced the Cambodian incursion, that he was going to cut off the supply lines for the Vietnamese coming through Cambodia. And so it was considered an expansion of the war. So there was protests all around the country in opposition to that, including at Kent State, where the protest involved burying the Constitution, because Nixon had killed the Constitution, which required an act of Congress to declare war. And so that was the Friday after his announcement. And there was another protest that day, not so well attended, but besides burying the Constitution, this fellow was he advertised in this Kent State, or the university newspaper, that he was gonna napalm a dog. And so lots of people showed up to protest this cruel act. And Bill, I'll think of his name. Bill Arthrell got up to speak, and he said, "Look at all of you here, hundreds of you to protest the napalming of a dog." And he goes, "We have no dog, we have no napalm, but aren't you upset about the napalm that's being dropped on civilians in Vietnam every day?" And so that was his kind of form of anti-war thing. So there was, the following Saturday, there was a building burned on the campus. The ROTC building was burned. And to me, that was always under suspicious circumstances, because I watched from the back of the crowd as somebody, assuming it's students, tried to ignite the building unsuccessfully. And then they suggested that we march around the campus to get more supporters, and I followed along behind as we did that. And Kent's a big campus. I think it's 85 acres, 24,000 students, probably 4,000 live on campus. We marched around the campus and came to the front. And when we got there, the Ohio National Guard was coming in from Ravenna to the east with troop trucks and jeeps. and half-tracks, armored personnel carriers. And when I saw that, I was like, woo, 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 right back to my dormitory, which was right across the field from the ROTC building, which when I left had not been burning. When I came back was fully involved in flames. And to me, that was very suspicious about who actually ignited the building, and I don't think anyone knows yet. So that got the attention of the governor, of President Nixon, Spiro Agnew, and there were conversations on the phone between Columbus, Ohio, and Washington, D.C. And so that's why the National Guard was there. And so the protest on Monday, May 4th, here's the conundrum that they had Monday, May 4th. The university was open for business as usual. And I was paying my own way. I worked through high school every summer to save up to go to school for 1 year. In those days, you could make enough money to do that. College tuition wasn't like it is now. And so classes were open as usual. 900 National Guardsmen with fixed bayonets and gas masks and tear gas were present on the campus. And they had decreed that they would not allow 4 or more students to gather together in any one place. So you had students trying to go to class, National Guardsmen trying to break them up. And so when I joined the group to protest, to lend my body to show support for their mission, it was more about the invasion and occupation of our campus by the Ohio National Guard. And the National Guard, I don't ever criticize a veteran or the National Guard as an institution, but there were 8 members of the National Guard who, by our investigations, seemed like they were most likely the ones who fired into the crowd of unarmed students. So my presence was to protest the invasion and occupation of the campus by our National Guardsmen. In fact, they made this announcement: students of Kent State, this is an illegal assembly, return to your dormitories. And as far as I'm concerned, they were the ones out of place, because during my whole time that day, May 4th, I was never more than about 70 yards from my dorm room, because I lived like right in the center of this, where this activity took place. So in my opinion, the protest that day was against the National Guard taking over the campus. And they weren't trained for crowd control.
Joe, you've got to forgive me. I've got to watch time for
All right,
everyone.
all right,
It's
we're done.
1:17, but
Good.
Joe, I know what this takes out of you.
Thank you,
and
Margaret.
You're doing this in your heart and mind, and
Thank you.
we'll be resuming this presentation next week. Thank you so much
Thank you
for
for your help.
being willing to present this to
You're
us.
absolutely right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.